Hello, and welcome to this skills video focusing on paper 2 source questions. In this video, we're going to have a look at what the question is asking for and what they're looking for in your reply. We're going to have a little think about structure, and we're going to have a look at an exemplar. The exemplar is actually going to be a Henry II source question from Route A, but the advice and the structure and the way that it's answered are still applicable if you're doing French Revolution, Route B, or if you're doing Mao's China with Route C. It would just be applied to different sources. So let's have a look at, first of all, what's the question asking? Well, paper 2 source questions ask you how far you could use two sources together. So it might be sources 1 and 2 or 3 and 4. How far you can use two sources together to investigate a specific thing. And the key here is different to paper 3. Paper 3 is one source, one longer source for two issues. On this occasion, it's two shorter sources, but their usefulness together to look at one particular thing. In your answers, you must use the sources together. You must conclude how useful the sources are as a pair. This is not a question asking you which source is more useful or valuable out of the two. It's asking about their usefulness or value together. And you must focus on how useful the sources are for the issue highlighted in the question. It's no good saying this source is really useful for something else, nor do they want to know kind of in general terms how useful would this type of source be. In the terms of the mark scheme, what they're looking for are three things. And actually, these are the same things that you would find in a paper 3 source question. To the extent that the mark scheme, the basic mark scheme, is exactly the same with just one or two words changed. So they're looking for three things. Firstly, have you shown source analysis skills? Do you understand what the sources are talking about? Can you explain what they're claiming? Secondly, have you got contextual knowledge of this particular issue that the question is about? Can you use that to show where the source is right and perhaps where they might not be evidence for the things the source is claiming, or even, in fact, as we'll see in the exemplar we look at, where the sources are perhaps not talking about something that they ought to be because of why they've been written to start with. And then thirdly, the judgment, and this is, of course, reaching and explaining a judgment and using the provenance within that to kind of explain perhaps why it is that these sources are really useful, quite useful, or not that useful. And these three things flow very much one into the other. Understanding the source, it comes through your contextual knowledge. You're able to understand it because of your contextual knowledge. And it's your contextual knowledge that then provides the basis for the judgment, so that in the end you judge it to be really useful because it's very accurate and really explains and shows all the things that I can think of about this particular issue, or you judge it to be not very useful because it seems pretty inaccurate and in fact it is misleading the readers in a particular way. It's likely that your answer will be somewhere in between that. It's likely that the two sources will be fairly useful for whatever it is they ask you, just because the exam board is likely to pick fairly useful sources more than anything else. So in terms of your structure to your answer, now it's really important to say that the exam board doesn't mind how you structure your answer, and they don't look for a particular structure in awarding marks. What they look for are those three things that I've mentioned already: source analysis skills, contextual knowledge, and your ability to reach a reasoned judgment. But having said that, structuring your answer like this will mean that you tick those boxes, and this is a good kind of rule of thumb structure to an answer. So firstly, do have an introduction. It's easy to kind of skip over that with source questions, but the introduction still provides a useful platform for explaining your answer. So you might have a line of context about the area being investigated. This immediately ticks that first box of contextual knowledge. And you should aim to introduce your judgment. You're going to try and explain why you think this through the answer. But if you can say straight away, oh, these two sources are really useful, then the rest of the answer becomes about you demonstrating that rather than leading someone to a place where they don't really know that they're going. Section 1 is a good time to look at what the sources agree on. Both sources agree. So in this, obviously, pick something that the sources agree on, quote both the sources on that particular thing, and use your knowledge to support, sometimes challenge this claim, normally support. Both sources, for instance, say that this really happened on that date. Here's the quote, and my evidence backs up that claim because I know that it did happen. Obviously, don't write it quite like that, but that's what you're aiming to do here. Use your knowledge to show that the two sources are right. And of course, if they agree about something, then it adds extra value to it because we're more certain that it's accurate. Ideally, at the end of this paragraph, I'd say at the end of every paragraph you ever write, it's useful to take the last sentence to say this is really useful, or this is quite useful, or this is not very useful. So if the two sources agree on something that's fundamental to the issue that you're looking at, then they're really useful. If the two sources are agreeing about something that's pretty peripheral and not very central to the issue that you're looking at, it's great that they agree. It's still useful, but it's not, of course, as useful as it would be otherwise. So section 1, anything the sources agree on. There might be quite a lot they agree on, and if there is, then repeat this process. Go through 2 or 3 things that the sources agree on, and that might be very much the bulk of your answer. However, there are times when the sources individually comment on things that are useful. There's a classic source question in the French Revolution topic about Marie Antoinette and views of her, and the two sources are very different to each other. And there, they don't cross over at all, they don't back each other up, but they provide really useful differing perspectives, showing how Marie Antoinette actually was a really divisive figure. So it might be that you spend more time hearing section 2, saying that individually the sources are useful. Now, exactly the same sort of process goes on here. You pick out a quote from the source. The source 2 says this. This is useful because it actually happened. This is where it happened. This is why it happened. And then say how useful that is. In general, the more points that you've spent where the sources agree on something in section 1, the less time and space you will have for section 2. So if the two sources work really well together, they perhaps back each other up, they talk about very kind of hand in glove things, things that work well together, it might be you spend all your time in section 1 and section 2 doesn't really happen at all. That's fine, so long as you're showing those 3 things, source analysis, contextual knowledge, judgment. It might be that the two sources provide 1 or 2 things that they work well together, and then after that you can't find anything else, in which case move on to section 2, and section 2 might be as big as section 1. Great, so long as you're picking things out of the source, you're backing them up with your knowledge, you're explaining why they're useful. And there might be occasions when you can't find any way in which the two sources agree on something, but you can see how they're useful individually. So ditch source 1 and go for source 2, section 2 straight away. The only downside to this, of course, is at the end, you need to explain why they're useful together as a package. Probably in that circumstance, you're going to say they're useful as a package together because they show different things about this particular issue, different perspectives. They talk about different time periods. They talk about different circumstances, perhaps, but explain why they're useful together at the end. There is a third section, and that is here. You might talk a little bit about limits to how useful the sources are. I'm going to scroll that all the way down, actually. Limits to how useful the sources are for this particular investigation. There might be things the sources disagree on. That's not very useful because there's direct contradiction. There might be points where you think the sources are inaccurate, misleading, or exaggerated, that they get things wrong, or they deliberately give a false impression to you. There might be sources, so there might be things that the sources deliberately don't mention. However, the exampled are aware that no source or no pair of sources can cover everything about a particular topic. And so the example do not want you to say, oh, I know lots of things that aren't in these sources, unless you think that the sources are deliberately obscuring something. There's a really good example of this in the exemplar that we'll look at. Ideally, for any of these points you make here in the limitations, explain it with reference to the provenance of the source. If it's misleading, explain why it's misleading from the provenance. If it's exaggerated, same sort of deal really, isn't it? If it's inaccurate, explain perhaps why that might be from the provenance. I should have said before this that there are useful things about provenance too, and these might be slightly more generic things, but these might be that the person was there and therefore knows this really well, and you should comment on those in sections 1 and 2. It's not wrong to talk about the provenance separately, and in fact the exemplar does exactly that for a reason that we'll see. But if you link it in with section 1 and 2, then you can focus on the usefulness of the provenance, and here in section 3 on the limitations, on how they explain why there are limitations to the sources. Finally, a conclusion. The conclusions should say how useful the two sources are together for this judgment, for this investigation, and explain why you have reached that judgment. So just to emphasize again, that is how you could approach this answer. And I think that's a pretty helpful framework to have in your mind, but you do need to be flexible. Firstly, they don't mind how you structure it. So if you want to do something different, it's not wrong necessarily, but you need to tick those 3 boxes of source analysis, contextual knowledge, provenance, and judgment. You ought to try and look at areas where the sources are in agreement on things. You might well talk about things where they're individually useful. You'll spend more time on this if you can. If you can't, you'll spend more time on this. And there ought to be some thought about why the sources are not perfect. Now, so we're going to have a look at this exemplar, and I'll walk you through it. If you've not studied Henry II before, you're missing out. It's a great topic, but you won't need to understand the topic in order to make sense of why this answer did really well. This is an answer from the 2017 A-level exam paper, and the exam board gave this answer 18, which is why I'm using it, because they really liked it, and I think it's really clear to see why. So this question was, how far could the historian make use of sources 3 and 4 together to investigate? Now, that's always the stem. How far can the historian make use of sources X and Y together to investigate this particular thing? In this case, the role of Henry II's family in the Great Rebellion of 1173-74. So Henry II was king at this time, and there was a rebellion against him, and his wife and several of his sons rebelled against him, along with various noblemen as well. So the focus needs to be on what these sources tell us about the role of Henry's family in that rebellion. So we know what that role was. Do the sources reflect what we know? Just to sort of give you a quick sort of eyes on the 2 sources. And the first one, source 3, is from Gerald of Wales. Didn't want to pin it down any further than that. And he's writing in 1189, so about 15 years afterwards. And look, chaplain and royal clerk in Henry II's court. So he's quite clearly quite close to events, maybe a little too close. We won't worry about what he says, but you can see that source here. Blah, blah, blah. And source 4 was written by Peter of Blois. To Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. This is the Queen, Henry II's wife, in 1173, just as the rebellion is starting. And you can see here that the letter was written at the request of Henry II. So let's have a look at this answer then. Just a reminder that the question is, how useful are they together to investigate the role of Henry II's family in the Great Rebellion? So one is written to the wife of Henry II, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the other one's written later on by Gerald of Wales. So the introduction then, sources 3 and 4 show insight into the causes of the Great Rebellion. Now I've highlighted in blue times that the candidate used their own knowledge explicitly. So here it says the first of 2 rebellions instigated by Henry II's family against him. So this is like a nice opening line of context. I know what we're talking about. We're talking about the Great Rebellion, and also know that actually there were other rebellions and that his family got involved in. So that's just kind of setting the scene and showing that you are in control of what you're saying. Now, the rest of the introduction is actually about an introduction of the answer that the candidate's going to give. And provenance and judgment are highlighted in green through this answer. So he says here, look, it could be argued that together the 2 sources are incredibly useful for an investigation, blah, blah, blah. However, given that both sources seem to offer perspectives in line with the king's own, their usefulness is limited. So he's saying that there are ways in which they could be seen as being useful, but overall, not so much because of the perspective that they both give. So now, because of that, in this particular answer, the candidate has actually chosen to start off with talking at length about the provenance of these two sources. Now, what's good here is that they do talk about them together, and they're also using this to tee up their whole answer, as we'll see. But I wouldn't normally go for this approach, but they've looked at it, they've planned it, and they've decided that this is the key thing that they need to kind of argue in their answer. And it makes sense if that's the key area for argument to do that first. So firstly, the provenance of both sources is in some ways highly useful for such an investigation, but considering that both seem to perceive Henry II favourably, they are limited in scope. He says, yeah, they're both written around the right time. Perspectives from both the early part of the rebellion as well as in its aftermath. So that's good. 1173, 1189, one kind of before as its beginning, one a bit of reflection afterwards. That's nice. However, source 4 was probably written at the request of Henry II, whereas source 3 was written by Gerald of Wales, a chaplain and royal clerk in Henry's court. If you read them through, they're not presenting the views of Henry the Younger, sometimes called the Young King. This is Henry's eldest son, or Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry II's wife. They're just portraying views in line with Henry II's view of the rebellion itself, and so therefore their usefulness is limited. What's great in your provenance stuff? So here you can see lots of stuff about provenance, all highlighted green. Good points, well made, nicely explained. Very good. But what really helps to make those points is if you are able to use the content and to show how the provenance has impacted on the content. So here, there's a bit of this later on as well, but here it says source 3 even refers to the wickedness of young Henry. And by labeling the king's eldest son, who did rebel against his father, wicked, it does suggest, of course, that the viewpoint is very much on the side of the king, Henry II, rather than offering, as it says here, various perspectives or a kind of a more detached perspective. So this is nice as well at the end of the paragraph, end of every paragraph, just having a little summary judgment. Here it is, the last sentence. Whilst in terms of time frame, these sources are useful, being near contemporary, showing the attitudes of the aftermath rebellion as well as during it. Ultimately, the provenance means the usefulness of these two sources together is still quite limited, even when used together. Now, just to emphasize that they've done this first, unusually, slightly controversially, but they've done it first because this is the keystone of their argument. They're going to say that there are useful things about these sources, but overall, the fact that they are both written from the perspective of Henry II, who was rebelled against in this Great Rebellion, it means that they are not going to be as accurate and helpful and reliable as we'd like them to be. So moving on into the contentness. Source 4 and to a lesser extent source 3 do reveal a lot about the role of Eleanor of Aquitaine, although some of it's exaggerated. So we know we're going to look here about Eleanor of Aquitaine. We know that they're going to say both sources help with that, mostly source 4. So we're using them together, two sources. We've got to focus. Eleanor of Aquitaine is part of the family of Henry II that rebels. And we know that we're going to conclude in the end that actually it's useful, but also exaggerated. So in this paragraph, look, just sort of flicking down it, the pinky stuff is quotes from the source. Blue is use of own knowledge. So this is good. And then green, of course, is judgment. Pink, quote, Eleanor of Aquitaine is a woman who left her husband. Blue here saying, yeah, she did leave her husband, but actually she left her husband in 1168. That's 5 years earlier. Seems a funny time to be writing to her to criticize her of that. And therefore, this seems, well, in fact, it doesn't say not that useful. So therefore, asking her to return to Henry 5 years later seems like a somewhat late request. So they're casting a little bit of doubt on the usefulness of the source there. Second point then, from source 3 this time. Quote again from the source, that Eleanor opened the way for her children to rise up against her father. And then here saying, yeah, that actually happened. Alongside her uncle, Eleanor played a key role in inspiring noblemen. Actually, sorry, the second quote's about the noblemen, the Dukes of Poitou and Angoulême, or something. In fact, I don't even know what it says, of Aquitaine to rebel against Henry's authority. So, quote, yes, the own knowledge, that the contextual knowledge backs that up. And so, therefore, this is valuable in and of itself. Furthermore, whilst source 3 seems to be alluding to the gentlemen of Henry's privy chamber when it says a man's household are his worst enemies, given the extraordinarily hostile tone of both texts towards Henry's family, perhaps this also puts blame on Eleanor. Overall, both do give great insight into Eleanor's role. So they are useful, even though they're anti-Eleanor, even though they have this kind of inbuilt perspective that's pro-Henry and against Eleanor. Actually, what they're saying is correct in a sense, that she did inspire rebellion, and that she had broken with her husband. She had left her husband, in essence, in 1168. So two sources used well together there. And then here again, both sources also demonstrate aspects of the roles of Henry's sons. Just teeing up first source, Gerald of Wales talks about young Henry withdrawing to the court of Louis, King of France. Again, the own knowledge saying, yes, he did this on the 5th of March, 1173, slipping away from Chinon Castle to Paris. However, and this is lovely, however, the assertion he took with him Richard and Geoffrey, two more of Henry II's sons, is slightly misleading, as they actually followed Henry soon after, rather than also fleeing on March 1173. So look here, we've kind of got source analysis. Yes, it says this, and that's backed up with my contextual knowledge, accurate, helpful, and useful. But actually, the source is misleading in suggesting this, that he took with him the other two sons, because we know that they followed later on, and therefore, a little bit misleading, a little bit cheeky. That's from source 3, Gerald of Wales source. Source 4 expands on the potential motives for this when it refers to Eleanor's role in encouraging her sons, but a little bit less to source 4 there. Again, look at the end of this paragraph, a nice little sort of mini judgment here regarding the role of Henry's sons. Both sources in conjunction do provide both actions and motives, something very useful when investigating the family's role in the Great Rebellion. So again, there's useful stuff here, and what's here is backed up by our contextual knowledge. However, just clicking on. So this candidate has spent, remember from section 1, they spent 2 paragraphs now talking about how both sources agree. Before that, they'd actually talked about the unhelpful provenance of both sources. And because they've done those 3 paragraphs, they now don't have time to talk about the 2 sources individually. That's fine. They've done plenty of analysis of the sources together, and they've talked about the 2 obvious elements of Henry II's family in relation to the question, that his wife and his sons. So now it's time to move on to section 3, which would be the limitations. Now, we've already talked about the limitations of the provenance, and that's going to be kind of unpacked here. So he says, however, neither source alludes to Henry's actions regarding both Eleanor and his sons. Now, full stop. There, the example are not interested in what the source doesn't say, unless you think that's deliberate. And if this sentence carries on here, in this case, neither source alludes to Henry's actions regarding both Eleanor and his sons, which is perhaps not surprising given their perspective. So what he's saying here is actually that they're missing things out that are important, and they're doing that because of who wrote them and when they wrote them. So then in that blue, there's some evidence of their own knowledge, that they're saying that these things aren't actually mentioned in the sources. And these things are Henry's element of blame in the Great Rebellion, and particularly in the way that he treated his family in the run-up to Great Rebellion that led to them having enough and fighting against him. This is relevant because we've been asked to investigate the role of Henry II's family in the Great Rebellion. And the role, if you read these two sources, it seems they're prominent, but they are kind of self-motivated, and they kind of did it out of the blue. Whereas if you have the full contextual knowledge that the sources don't provide, you would understand that they rebel. They certainly play that prominent role, but that it was very much a rebellion of Henry's own making, that he was being kind of treating them unfairly, and in a way that was, well, ultimately very unhelpful to him. So this is really nice integration of the provenance with their own knowledge, to say that, yeah, they're missing things out, they're very important things, and they're doing that because of the type of sources they are. And again, look, this last mini judgment sentence, therefore in something, the ways in which Henry aggravated his family in the lead up to rebellion, even together their usefulness is limited, as they miss this fundamental, in fact, I don't know what it says, but yeah, this word here, fundamental, is really helpful, because in this student's judgment, what is missing is critical to understanding the rebellion. I might look at this and say, well, actually, in understanding the role of them in the rebellion, these sources are pretty useful. They don't provide so much perspective on why the rebellions took place, but I'm happy to say they're useful because I think that the role is pretty clear. This student, though, is saying, well, that their motivation is all important to the rebellion, and therefore they're not so useful. That's fine. The exam board aren't looking for you to, find the answer that they think. They're looking to see you thinking through the sources, and linking that sensibly with what you know and your analysis. So here's the conclusion. To conclude, whilst both sources contribute information regarding the role of both Eleanor of Aquitaine and her sons, the limited perspective of both seemingly written, I think, in order to portray Henry II in a good light, especially source 4, written seemingly to admonish Eleanor, means they fail to evaluate Henry's own responsibility in aggravating his family to rebel. Therefore, their usefulness is only limited in such an investigation. Now, that's pretty short, but we already know what that conclusion is going to be, because they've been clear about it all the way through. Those final lines of each paragraph have really teed this up very nicely. We knew from the first, in fact, we knew from the introduction that they were going to say of limited usefulness. The first paragraph about the provenance explained why they felt that these were not going to be so useful. And they showed there in the next two paragraphs what information was contributed, which is this bit here, and those are the useful bits. And then in the final paragraph, they explained why what they felt was deliberately missed out was of critical importance to explaining explaining the role of the family in the Great Rebellion. And so therefore the value of this source is limited in that sense. So just take us back to the beginning, in concluding. I hope that's been helpful to see both what paper source question is for, what they're hoping to get out of it, and how you could approach it, both in terms of like structure, but then also that exemplar, mostly fitting around the structure, but kind of being a bit flexible on it too. Just to remind them that these are the things that they want you to do. Using the sources together, that answer did it all the way through the answer, which is one of the things that made it really good. It must conclude how useful they are as a pair. It certainly did that. It must focus on the issue highlighted in the question. It certainly did that, focusing on the family all the way through and explaining how they were culpable for the rebellion, but not as culpable as the sources made out. And then just a reminder that the mark scheme is looking for three things. Can you explain what the sources are claiming? And again, that was done really, really well in this answer. Have you got contextual knowledge that can judge whether what the sources say is accurate? Really, really well done. Again, very confident about what they're talking about. And this is where your knowledge really pays off, if you've got good knowledge about the particular issue. And then judgment. Have you reached and explained a judgment? And does that use the provenance to justify it? And in this case, of course, the provenance was used massively. In many cases, the provenance might play much of a less prominent role. So I hope that's helpful. do look around for other exemplars, and particularly perhaps in your own route if you are doing route B or C. But hopefully that gives you an idea about what a good answer looks like that you can use in your own writing. Thank you very much. Goodbye.